Welcome back, everybody. It's another Monday live stream on Synapse Care Solutions YouTube channel. I'm excited to have you back. And today we're going to do a short and sweet training on the 3 features of an ILL, I-L-L, aEEG. This is going to help you identify those abnormal patterns using this really quick and easy algorithm. So I hope you enjoyed today's replay. It's actually from November 2018, so almost 5 years ago, but the principles are still relevant for you today. Hope you enjoy this presentation. I will see you at the end.
So welcome everyone to November 2018 live Q&A call, and just a little quick refresher to help you move forward in your aEEG skills. What I decided to talk about today are the features of a bad aEEG. So I think I've mentioned these before, but if not, I call these ILL, I-L-L, aEEGs. And of course, the number one bad sign of any pathological EEG tracing or brain activity is intermittent uprisings, meaning seizures, right? And so seizures can come in many forms, and they are very rarely as beautiful as this example. But I wanted to talk about these intermittent uprisings and some of the features that we know are the hallmarks of seizures on aEEG. So let's talk about what are these features of seizures on aEEG. So what we're looking for are the archway, so a kind of a rounded arch in there. And we want an archway, so this is a beginning, a middle, and an end, a crescendo, decrescendo of our aEEG band. And so I'll see that we're coming along, and all of a sudden we have this increase in voltage, remembering that the distance between the hash marks or the gray lines are 10 minutes, and that each single line of aEEG represents 15 seconds. So as the voltage of the seizure begins to increase, we begin to see a uprising of the lower margin. And then not until we get almost here a few minutes into the seizure does the upper amplitude also begin to be influenced. And as the seizure continues and becomes more rhythmic, the differential between the voltages of the seizure becomes smaller and smaller. And this is what causes the compression or the thinning of the aEEG band. Combined with the fact that over 10 microvolts, remember we move into the logarithmic part of this scale. And now instead of there being only 10 microvolts between here and here, now once we're above this line between here and here, the equidistance between these two lines, we have 90 microvolts. So the seizure voltage is high, but it's also in a very narrow bandwidth in the sense of there's not a lot of variability, which is what causes the shrinking of that. But you can see that the amplitude, total amplitude is increasing. This is what causes that crescendo at the top. And then the amplitude begins to decrease. The differential between the highs and lows still stays very small. And so we have here this narrow bandwidth that then extinguishes and goes back to baseline. So we're looking for a rise in the upper and the lower margins. We're looking for a thinning of the band, representing that the voltage itself is actually becoming more similar. There's less variability from beat to beat to beat in that 15-second window. Bring that the bandwidth of any aEEG is a representation of the variability of your aEEG voltages, your brain voltages. So when those seizures are happening, the voltages are very similar because the pattern is so similar. And so the bandwidth becomes very, very tight and very narrow. And so that's what we see. Beginning, middle, and end, a crescendo, decrescendo, and then we see a narrowing of that band and upper and lower margin. So those are the features that we're always looking for on the aEEG. And then of course, when we come in with our markers and our cursors and we decompress the EEG that formed that aEEG, we're looking for the presence or the absence of artifact. So we're looking here, what do we see? Do we see movement? Do we see padding? Do we see muscle? Do we see a spike and a wave, a spike and a wave? So again, just like we see here, some very rapid spikes and then a wave. a slow wave, they would call it, as the brain recovers. And we're looking for the rhythmic pattern. So this particular monitor screenshot is 10 seconds. Each line up here representing one half of a second. So this is 5 seconds up to here, an additional 5 seconds. So depending on your screen length or the way you've set it, you may have 10 seconds or 15 seconds. But by definition, a seizure requires a rhythmic pattern that lasts for more than 10 seconds. So we can see here in this snapshot that this pattern is repetitive for the entire 10 seconds. The other way to think about it is, if I scroll this to the right or scroll this to the left, can I pretty much predict what I'm going to see? That's another indication where you're starting to see rhythmicity, is when you can predict what you're going to see next. Okay, so intermittent uprisings is always a sign of an ill EEG, where we have these, where we validate it with the actual EEG. So here's another example. These are a little bit less clear when we're looking at the aEEG, but this is repetitive seizures. So happening for, this is about 5 minutes, 15, 25, 35, 45, 55. So for almost an hour, right up in here, we're seeing these intermittent uprisings. And here's one, and here's one, and here's one, and here's one, and here's one. So we have these intermittent uprisings, which become very clear to see as time evolves. And then, of course, opening up one of these uprisings and validating whether or not we see a spike and a wave and a rhythmic behavior of the EEG, and lasting for more than 10 seconds. But the intermittent uprisings here are the things that really clue us into there being an issue with the brain, not necessarily with the background activity. The background looks pretty good, but there's definitely these uprisings which give us a clue towards the brain dysfunction. And then, of course, we've all seen pictures that unfortunately look like this, where we have just constant uprisings. These aren't even intermittent anymore. They are continuous uprisings. And this would be our status epilepticus. And again, another sign of a very, very sick brain. So the other feature we want to think about when it comes to a sick brain, which then results in an ill-looking EEG or aEEG, is the sleep-wake cycling. So for our patients in the NICU, we expect to see sleep-wake cycling. Even as early as 28 weeks, we expect to see some cycling at the lower margins. But when we're talking about term babies, we expect to see a nice, robust, thin, thick pattern. So here's a great example of continuous normal voltage, where we have that thickening out, where we have that cycling down into the discontinuous range, and coming back up, and then cycling back down, and coming back up, and cycling back down. Personally, I like to see one nice cycle at least every hour. So one while the baby is asleep, and to see this kind of rhythmically happening. So an organized pattern, that's a very good sign. So when we have loss of sleep-wake cycling, there are a few reasons why that happens. The number one reason I see is medications, right? Would be the number one thing that we see. The second more common thing that we see is chronic hypoxia causing a dysregulation of the sleep cycling. I see this a lot in the cardiac babies. So they're plugging along on PGE, they have low mixed sats that we are expecting, and when you monitor them with aEEG, they have okay background patterns, so their voltage is good, but the hypoxia just does not allow their brain to organize into that rhythmic sleep-wake pattern that you would expect for their age. And it's just one of the hallmarks that I've seen over the years of this loss of cycling. So this to me begins to tell me that the brain is not tolerating that level of hypoxia, and that maybe it's time to have a conversation about that. By adding on NIRS can give you some kind of secondary backup for those kids, especially where you can say, seeing this lack of sleep-wake cycling, what's the actual brain saturation? And so although systemic sats may be good, you'll be surprised how low the neural sats are. That can, again, help have a conversation with that. The other time we have that loss of sleep-wake cycling is in our mild HIE babies. So babies who are being evaluated for cooling. We saw this a lot back in the CoolCap trial, where the kids would be evaluated with aEEG, and we would see that they would have okay backgrounds, but they would be lacking sleep-wake cycling. So really that reemergence of sleep-wake cycling really is a sign of the brains being well, and they're able to then organize those kind of cellular communications that have to happen in order to synchronize that activity. So loss of sleep-wake cycling or lack thereof, and we'll talk a little bit about lack thereof here in a second. The third area is really a lack or loss of continuous activity. And so if we think about, I'm going to just go back to this slide here where we have our continuous normal voltage, where we have those borders, the upper border above 10 and the lower border above 5, except during sleep when we allow for that cycling to happen. Then we have our discontinuous normal voltage, where that lower margin drifts below 5, but our upper margin stays above 10. When we have this lack of continuous activity, so when we expect to see continuous normal voltage, right, over 34, 35 weeks, we expect to see a pretty continuous normal activity, so upper margin above 10, lower margin above 5. But when we don't have that, when we have a loss of that first continuity, so if we lose the lower margin, that becomes a discontinuous pattern. And then if we lose the upper margin, not being even above 10, that is also a very bad sign, right? We're having continuous activity, but it's all low. And then in between this discontinuous normal pattern and continuous low voltage, we have that burst suppression pattern. And burst suppression is a mixed pattern. So like I was talking about with the seizures, where the activity becomes very consistent as the rhythmic pattern continues, with burst suppression, you have this excessive discontinuous pattern. Remember, discontinuous means mixed amplitudes. So we have burst, which is big, 25, 50, 75, 100 microvolts burst. And then we have suppression, almost nothing. So what happens with this, it's discontinuous, it's excessively discontinuous. And then with low voltage, you just have lack of activity. So we want to think about an injured brain on this spectrum of normal activity to a little bit of a lack of normal voltage, so the drifting. Then we want to think about overall, how strong is the brain? Does it even make any bursting at all? Is it ever reaching above 10? If it's not, then it's very bad. And then of course our flat or our isoelectric, even worse. And then that burst suppression being that in-between place where the brain is still firing, but then it goes flat, firing flat, firing flat. So we have this lack of continuous normal activity is a very bad sign. Lack or loss of continuous activity. So let's talk for a second about how this relates to preterm infant patterns. So we know seizures, whether you're term or preterm, we know those are bad. But let's talk about whether or not you see the patterns you expect for age. And we remember when we have our very preterm babies in our 23, 24, 25, 26 week range, even up to maybe 28 range, we have a lack of cycling oftentimes, or we may see just the emergence of cycling. And we have this loss of continuity or continuous activity, right? It's expected that they would have this. So we want to think about what is expected for age, and then we want to think about what we see on the aEEG. And so because these are preterms, these aren't ill brain EEGs, these are maturing aEEGs. And so I don't want to confuse the issue too much, but just to say that discontinuous is normal in every behavioral state for the very preterm baby. And then as we get closer and closer to term, and even here, look at 31 weeks, we begin to see cycling, and we begin to see increased continuity, meaning increase in the lower margin towards 5. And then here, even at 33 weeks, these are healthy preterm infants with no brain injuries. We see that we've got this beautiful cycle, but it's not one every hour, it's one every few hours. But there's definitely variability and emerging towards that continuous background. So the lower margin being up to 5. So as age increases, continuous activity increases, the lower margin increases. That is exactly what we want to see. And then by 34 to 36 weeks, we see discontinuous only during that quiet sleep pattern, which is, again, normal. That's the term pattern. So one of the other features of continuity reflects on density of the pattern. And so I'm going to use burst suppression to help illustrate this because I think that it does it the best. So you'll see here in this pattern, you'll see, let's look at the EEG first. So at the EEG you have here, you have this suppressed activity and then a burst. So again, you have this mixing of voltages, which cause you to have a rather low bottom margin and a rather high upper margin. And what we see with this, when there are more than 15-second gaps in bursts, we have blank space. So the density of the pattern reflects how continuous the activity is. Whether the activity is normal or whether the activity is bursting in an abnormal pattern, the density reflects continuity. And so I want you to say, or continuousness of activity, right? So depending on how you want to say that. So the density is really important. And so we measure this on monitors. Some monitors can count the bursts. And if they can count the burst, which is defined as voltages greater than 25, then it can count the interburst interval. And so interburst interval is really another way to quantitatively define the continuousness or the continuity of the activity of the brain. And so you can see here where we have a tight, dense band. This is still burst suppression. You have a flat lower margin, you have bursting over here, you have a very thick bandwidth. But because it's so dense, that tells you that there's more activity. There are more bursts happening. So I hesitate to say that's a better sign, but there's certainly more activity. Then you have down here, you have those gaps again. So you have gaps between the bursts. The bursts are further and further apart. IBI, interburst interval, greater than 30 seconds or less than 30 seconds. So that can be a way to define it. Or you can look at the number of bursts per hour. And again, using technology, we can count these. The old way was to actually suspend the tracing and to scroll and count the number of bursts per hour or per minute. So continuity, so these gaps in voltage can really give us a sign of health of the brain or lack of health of the brain. So when we're thinking about a dysmature aEEG, especially for a preterm baby, so we've already said seizures are never good, doesn't matter how old you are. But when we think about our preterm babies, we want to think about these features and whether or not they're progressing forward if you've been monitoring them serially, or if we're seeing some of this loss of continuous activity, a regression in pattern, or a lack or a loss of sleep-wake cycling that was maybe once there. And thinking about the gestational differences, we want to see babies, again, progress towards that more continuous activity. But I also want to recognize that if you have a 35-weeker, or let's say a 30-weeker, right? If a 30-weeker who has a pattern that looks more like a 25-weeker, so you know the lower margin is much closer to like the 1, 2, 3 range. If you're not having really nice cycling happening, that's not normal. And just because they're preterm, we need to be thinking about it's not just okay to just be discontinuous because you're preterm. There comes a point where the pattern itself is dismature, that we don't have enough cycling, we don't have enough continuous activity. The lower margin is not reaching up towards that 5, and that is not normal. So that it is still considered ill, even though it is not a term baby brain. So just trying to make sure that you're thinking about that as we have expectations that the aEEG will improve with time. So that was the last of the little slides that I created for today. I hope that you found that review helpful in thinking about we know what we want to expect for normal, but what is abnormal. Any questions about that? Or any comments? And of course, you all know how to get a hold of me. If you need me, email me, text me, all of those. Find me on social media. I'm always happy to answer questions. We did send out an email last week around a new brain cooling toolkit for those of you who are medical directors, CNSs, educators, cooling team leaders. We do have a brain cooling course where you can actually get all of your training for your whole team, but we also have a toolkit that can help you to assess your current program. So if you haven't seen that, let me know and I'm happy to send that out. And you were asking about the chronic hypoxia for the SAT. So yeah, I'm talking about just those kind of typical chronic cyanotic hearts where we've got our SAT targeting in the lower 80s range. And every baby tends to have a little bit of a different tolerance of that. So for sure, but I'm seeing it more like in the 80 to 85 range. Not the preemie, not the chasing preemie, although there are other issues with that type of intermittent hypoxia for sure. So I'm talking about the cardiac mixed SAT kid where you're sitting in the 80s. Yep. And it's a very interesting group of babies to monitor with aEEG and NIRS because we've been targeting systemic SATs and thinking that was the thing that really mattered. And now we're becoming much more aware that what we see at the systemic SAT is not always what we see at the tissue level. And then how does that impact function? That's what we see on the aEEG. Yeah, great question. So anyways, if you guys are interested in the brain cooling course, and of course we have our aEEG course and lots of online courses, just check us out at synapsecare.com. And so anyways, hope you all have a great rest of your week.
Okay, I hope you enjoyed this replay. It's been really fun to go back and pull some of our old Q&A calls. Oh, do you guys want me to start doing live calls again? That would be really fun to answer your questions. But anyways, if you want to grab any of the free resources that I mentioned in this video, click on the QR code here to visit our website, and definitely send me a message if you don't see something that you're looking for. I know we have our aEEG course, our brain cooling course, as well as some free resources, the toolkit, and our 7 steps ebook. I hope you have a great week, and I will see you next week.